It started with a small cedar box my husband left behind, a note inside that read, "Do not trust my son. Save yourself," and a fermentation barrel sealed with wax that held the only thing that could save me. By the end, my stepson would be pressing apples in a pair of custom canvas overalls with the words, "Juice the Truth," stitched across the back, and every bottle of my new flagship cider would carry his federal fraud case number printed right on the label beneath the ingredients list. My name is Claire. I'm 54 years old. My husband Martin built custom timber frame furniture in a workshop behind our house, a quiet man whose hands smelled permanently of linseed oil and sawdust. Before I met him, I spent 8 years as a junior bookkeeper for a mid-size construction firm, and that head for numbers never left me. Even after I left the firm to raise his son Trent from the age of 13 and keep our blended household running, I still balanced every account to the penny, logging grocery receipts in a spiral notebook with a mechanical pencil that never left my purse. That habit would later become a weapon. Martin wasn't just a craftsman. He had a mind for contingencies, for hidden dovetails and reinforcement blocks that you never saw until the piece was stressed. He applied that same thinking to people, and in his final years he'd started watching his son with a quiet, tired sorrow. Trent was charming in a brittle way, a young man who learned early that a smile could open doors faster than a key. He'd float through jobs in sales and real estate speculation, always one deal away from making it big, always borrowing against the next promise. Martin never confronted him directly. He just started making notes, small observations he'd tuck away in a cedar chest. I didn't know that then. I only learned it after the heart attack that took Martin while he was hauling applewood for a cider press he'd been designing, a 50-gallon French oak barrel he'd carved by hand for weeks in the workshop. The life insurance paid out $130,000, and I tucked it into a high-yield savings account at First Federal while I learned to sleep alone again. The funeral was a small affair at a Unitarian chapel with wooden beams that reminded me of Martin's workshop. Trent gave a eulogy that was polished and vague, like a press release. Elise stood beside him in a black dress, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that never seemed to get wet. She was a real estate agent who staged homes to sell faster, and I realized later she was staging grief the same way, arranging furniture around an emotional hole so no one would see the rot beneath. I sat in the front pew with my hands folded, a widow in a navy dress I'd worn to PTA meetings a decade earlier, and I let the organ music wash over me. Within 24 hours of the graveside service, they showed up at my door without an invitation. Trent carried a legal pad and an energy that hummed with suppressed urgency. Elise wore large sunglasses and carried a tote bag full of file folders and sticky notes, like she was about to stage an open house on my grief. They said they wanted to help with Dad's affairs, which sounded generous, but within the first hour they were opening closets, appraising tools in the workshop, and making piles on the dining room table. Keep, sell, trash. I stood in the kitchen brewing Earl Grey tea, listening to the shuffle and murmur, the sound of my life being sorted by people who didn't know the difference between Martin's favorite chisel and a junk drawer screwdriver. I heard Elise's voice drift in from the hallway, smooth and practiced. "There's nothing valuable in that old box, just toss it." A moment later, Trent walked out of the hallway with a small cedar chest, its brass corners dulled, the lid slightly warped from decades of attic heat. He held it over a black contractor bag he'd placed by the front door and let it fall without looking at me. "Just Dad's junk," he said, already turning toward a bandsaw he thought he could sell. I kept stirring my tea. That night, after they left to pick up wine and talk strategies at their own house, I walked outside to the trash bags lined up beside the garage. The air was cool and smelled of wet leaves. I pulled the bag open and fished out the cedar box, brushing coffee grounds off the lid. I carried it inside to the kitchen table, where the overhead light made a pool on the old oak surface. Inside, nestled in a bed of felt that smelled like sawdust and thyme, were a few broken watch gears, a lapel pin from Martin's union days, and a single sheet of heavy yellow paper folded exactly twice. I opened it with careful fingers. The handwriting was Martin's, a hurried cursive that still managed to be beautiful, the ink slightly smudged at the corner as if he'd folded it before it was fully dry. It said, "Claire, do not trust Trent. He's my son, but he's crooked in ways I couldn't fix. If anything ever happens to me, remember the barrel. Keep the true copy safe. Save yourself." I read it 3 times, then folded it and tucked it into my sleeve. I put the box in the back of my underwear drawer behind a stack of cotton slips, and I went to bed with the note pressed flat beneath my pillow. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family loyalty is earned, not entitled. Trent and Elise didn't wait for my grief to settle. Over the following 10 days, they positioned themselves as my protectors, my guides through the wilderness of widowhood. Elise cooked bland, butterless meals and talked about how dangerous it was for a woman my age to live alone on a property this size, with its outbuildings and the old orchard spreading across 3 acres behind the workshop. Trent presented a business plan sketched on a yellow legal pad. We could turn Martin's orchard into a craft cidery. The trees were already producing heritage bittersweet apples, Brown Snout and Dabinot and Kingston Black, that had been planted by Martin's grandfather and neglected for years. Trent said the land would be his to inherit anyway, so he'd contribute it as his share. I could invest the $130,000 into equipment, licensing, and the first year's operating costs. "It's what Dad would have wanted," he said, his voice soft and almost convincing. He was building that press for a reason. I nodded and said I'd think about it, all while Martin's note was a cold pebble in my mind. I let a week pass watching them. Elise began screening my mail, claiming she was helping me stay organized. Trent spent an afternoon going through the filing cabinet in Martin's workshop and asked for the keys to the safe deposit box at First Federal, which I pretended to have misplaced. I knew I needed legal protection, so I quietly called Gloria Markham, the attorney who had handled Martin's will. She was a compact woman in her 60s with short silver hair and a manner that wasted no time. I told her about the proposed partnership, and she agreed to draft an agreement that would protect my interests. We met at her office, a small suite with burgundy carpet and a notary who chewed spearmint gum. I paid Gloria myself, with a check from my separate account, so there would be no question of influence. The document was 6 pages long. I would hold a 45% stake in a new LLC called Harvest Hollow Cider. Trent's LLC would hold 55%, and I would receive a lifetime supply of farmhouse cider, defined as 2 cases per month of whatever we produced, in perpetuity. The dissolution clause required unanimous written consent, notarized original signatures, and 30 days' notice filed with the county clerk. There was a morality clause that allowed for forfeiture of shares upon conviction of fraud. Gloria slid the document across the table, and I signed each page with a steady hand, using a blue rollerball pen that left a distinctive ink trail. The notary stamped and signed, and I walked out with the original, which I placed in my safe deposit box at First Federal that same afternoon. But I also made a mistake. Grief is a fog that warps your sense of time and proportion. Elise's constant pressure, her voice always dripping with concern, wore me down over the following months. She convinced me that selling my home would be a smart financial move, that I could move into their guest suite and they could take care of me. It was framed as a kindness, but I knew it was surveillance. They wanted me in a box where they could see every phone call, every piece of mail, every visitor. I agreed to sell the house to a young couple who didn't mind the creaky floorboards. I packed my books and my lockpicking kit into cardboard boxes and moved into a spare room with beige wallpaper and a window that looked out onto their manicured lawn. I played the role they assigned me, a foggy, compliant widow who couldn't find her own checkbook and who nodded gratefully when Elise set a plate of unseasoned chicken in front of her. But underneath, I was cataloguing every detail. I kept a small notebook in the false bottom of my jewelry box, recording dates, overheard phone snippets, and the names of companies that appeared on Trent's mail. The orchard began to thrive. We obtained a farm winery permit and started production under the radar, selling at farmers' markets and local bottle shops. I threw myself into learning the craft. I studied the chemistry of malolactic fermentation, the way bacteria convert harsh malic acid into softer lactic acid for a rounder mouthfeel. I learned to measure Brix levels with a refractometer, targeting 21 Brix for a crisp, off-dry finish. I managed the tasting room and kept the books, but I never let on that I understood the financials in granular detail. I presented myself as the sweet older lady who poured samples and wiped down the counter, while Trent handled marketing and distribution. He was good at that part, I'll admit. His charm worked on distributors, and within 2 years we were turning a profit. Elise spent money like the orchard had already been sold, buying a new SUV and booking a coastal vacation that she talked about constantly. Then the offer came. Orchard Fresh Brands, a national beverage conglomerate out of North Carolina, reached out through a broker. Their letter of intent proposed acquiring the entire business, including the brand, the recipes, the equipment inventory, and the goodwill, for $900,000. I saw the letter on Trent's desk one morning, left carelessly under a coffee mug. I read it twice, memorized the number, and replaced the mug exactly where I'd found it. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I knew from reading dissolution clauses in my bookkeeping days that an acquisition would trigger a buyout of my 45% stake, and that meant $405,000 coming to me. I also knew that Trent would never willingly hand over that kind of money. A week later, the frantic edge appeared. Trent started taking calls at odd hours, slipping into his home office and shutting the door with a click that echoed through the house. I'd hear his voice through the wall, a low, insistent hum that occasionally spiked into irritation. Elise sharped online for coastal property in North Carolina, leaving browser tabs open on the shared computer, which I noticed and pretended not to see. But the real sign came one evening in early autumn. I was lying on the living room couch with a crochet blanket over my legs, my eyes half closed, while the evening news droned on low volume. Trent walked through the front hallway on his phone, his voice dropping to a sharp, conspiratorial hush as he passed. I didn't move. I let my breathing slow. "The 45% has been dissolved," he said, each word bitten out. "The notary backdated it, just send the wire to my account once we sign. No, she doesn't know, she's barely aware of what day it is. Just move the money." Ice water flooded my veins, but I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes closed, cataloguing the exact phrasing, the time of day, the faint smell of his cologne. Then I waited until his footsteps retreated down the hall, before I allowed myself to open my eyes and stare at the ceiling, planning. The next morning, I offered to fix a slow-draining sink in the guest bathroom. Elise looked at me like I'd offered to perform brain surgery. I shrugged and said I used to help Martin swap out P-traps, which was partially true. I'd held the flashlight while he did it, but I'd also watched enough plumbers during my construction office days to know a trap from a vent pipe and how to clear a clog without flooding the vanity. I unscrewed the slip nuts under the sink, pulled out a foul wad of hair and dental floss with a bent wire hanger, and reassembled the whole thing in 12 minutes while Elise hovered in the doorway with an expression of mild alarm. Later that afternoon, I watched her call a plumber to fix a running toilet in the master bath because she didn't know how to jiggle the flapper. The contrast settled something deep in me. They were image and bluster, dependent on other people's labor for their own comfort. I was the one who still knew how things worked at a mechanical level. That realization became a foundation. I needed physical proof. Trent and Elise kept a home office at the end of the hall, a room with built-in bookshelves and a metal filing cabinet that was always locked. I'd brushed past it enough times to recognize the lock, a basic wafer lock, the kind installed on inexpensive office furniture, with a keyhole no wider than a fingernail. A bored teenager could rake it open with a paperclip if they had patience. I had better tools and more practice. I was a locksmith's daughter. My father owned a small shop in a town 2 hours west, and I'd grown up behind the counter, sorting key blanks and learning to rekey Schlage deadbolts before I could drive. I still carried a small leather case of picks in my purse, a professional set with a short hook, a rake, and a tension wrench made of spring steel, a habit Martin used to tease me about. That case had travelled with me from my old house into the guest suite, tucked into a zippered pocket behind my wallet. I waited for a Thursday afternoon when Trent and Elise were scheduled to attend a Chamber of Commerce mixer across town. I watched their car pull out of the driveway, then waited an extra 10 minutes to be sure. Then I walked into the hallway with my case in hand, knelt in front of the filing cabinet, and went to work. I inserted the tension wrench into the keyway, applied light torque with my index finger, and slid the short hook inside. Wafer locks are simple, a series of flat wafers that must be lifted to the shear line. I scrubbed the hook across the wafers twice, listening for the faint click of each one setting. The lock turned on the second pass, a smooth 90-degree rotation that felt like the tumblers of a plan falling into place. I was inside in under 90 seconds. My heart hammered, but my hands were steady. The top drawer held hanging file folders with handwritten labels. I flipped through them, tax returns, insurance policies, warranty booklets for appliances, and then a manila folder at the very back labeled Dissolution Harvest Harlow. I lifted it out and laid it on the desk. Inside was a single document, a dissolution agreement bearing my supposed signature. The date was 6 weeks earlier, a Tuesday when I distinctly remembered being at the dentist for a 3-hour root canal. The ink was too uniform, the loops of my capital C too tight, the slant slightly forward instead of my natural backhand. The notary stamp belonged to a woman named Deborah Kellerman. I photographed the page with my phone, then set the phone aside and used my other hand to write down the notary's commission number. After I relocked the cabinet and returned to my room, I searched the state notary database on my phone. Deborah Kellerman's commission had expired 14 months before the date on the stamp. The stamp itself was forged or stolen. I felt a chill of vindication. Beneath the dissolution was the acquisition term sheet from Orchard Fresh Brands, specifying that the full $900,000 was to be wired into Trent's personal business account upon closing, with a schedule showing a $7,000 crate of thanks to be delivered to me at the closing, described as in-kind compensation for my lifetime cider supply. The audacity of it, the legal-sounding phrase wrapped around a theft, made my jaw tighten. I photographed every page, front and back, including the routing number of the designated bank account. Then I reassembled the folder exactly as I'd found it, relocked the cabinet, and walked back to my room with the evidence burning a hole in my phone's memory. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and let the rage wash through me, cold and clarifying, until it settled into something harder. Then I remembered Martin's note. Remember the barrel. Martin had been building a custom French oak fermentation barrel in the weeks before he died. It sat in the temperature-controlled cidery building behind the orchard, a 50-gallon cooperage he'd assembled with steamed staves and hand-hammered steel hoops. On the head of the barrel he'd carved a small inscription, "For Claire's Reserve." He'd sealed the bung with beeswax and told me, "Don't open it until you really need it. There's a surprise inside." At the time I thought he meant a batch of special perry he'd been experimenting with, a blend of pears and aged in oak. But now, with his note fresh in my mind, I understood he'd been trying to tell me something entirely different. A dead man's switch. A failsafe. I drove to Harvest Hollow that same night using my own set of keys. The cidery was dark and still, the stainless steel fermentation tanks gleaming in the low light from the exit signs. The barrel sat behind the row of tanks on a small wooden pallet, dust filming its curved oak. I ran my hand over the beeswax seal, feeling the ridges of Martin's tool marks. I didn't have a proper tool, so I grabbed a butter knife from the tasting room bar and worked the blade under the wax until it cracked and fell away in pieces. I pulled the bung out and peered inside. The barrel was empty, hollow, but at the bottom, resting on a bed of dried apple pomace that crumbled at the touch, was a waterproof PVC tube with threaded end caps and rubber gaskets. I lifted it out, unscrewed the cap and slid out 2 rolled documents. The first was the original notarized partnership agreement I'd signed with Trent 2 years ago, the one I'd placed in my safe deposit box, but this copy had an additional page I'd never seen, a succession contingency addendum. It was drafted by Martin, signed by Martin, and notarized by Gloria Markham on the same day as the original partnership. The addendum stated that in the event of any attempted dissolution or transfer of my ownership share without my physical presence and the presentation of this very original document, a dead man's switch would activate, a hold on all asset transfers, enforced by a compliance officer at First Federal Bank who held a corresponding affidavit. The language was precise, the legal boilerplate tight. I read it 3 times, my lips moving silently. The second document was a letter from Martin, handwritten in the same hurried cursive, dated exactly 1 week before his heart attack. It was 3 pages long. He explained that he'd been watching Trent's financial behavior for years, small deceptions that grew into patterns, and he'd become certain that after his death, Trent would try to manipulate me out of my inheritance. So he'd quietly set up a parallel LLC called Martin's Reserve Holdings, with me as the sole member, and filed a UCC-1 financing statement with the county clerk. The UCC filing tied my 45% ownership stake in Harvest Hollow to that LLC as collateral, meaning any sale, dissolution, or encumbrance would require a release from the LLC, and the only person authorized to sign that release was me. With the original wet ink document in hand, the UCC filing was a public record, buried in the clerk's online database, searchable by any title company doing due diligence. Martin had deliberately made it boring, bureaucratic, something that would go unnoticed until it was triggered. He'd even included the filing number for me to reference. At the bottom of the letter he wrote, "Claire, you're stronger than they think. Protect what's yours. I love you." Tucked into the letter was a business card, Rachel Keane, Senior Compliance Officer, First Federal Bank, with a handwritten note on the back in Martin's script. "She knows everything. Trust her." I sat on the cold concrete floor of the cidery with my back against the fermentation tank and cried for the first time since the funeral. Then I wiped my face, put the documents back in the tube and drove home. The next morning I called Rachel Keane. Rachel answered on the second ring, her voice calm and professionally warm. She said she'd been expecting my call, though she didn't know when it would come. Martin had briefed her years ago, before his heart attack, leaving a sealed envelope with the affidavit and instructions to monitor the Harvest Hollow LLC filings for any unusual activity. She confirmed that the dissolution Trent had forged had been filed with the county 2 weeks ago, but that the UCC flag she'd placed on the title had automatically generated a compliance hold. The Orchard Fresh Title Company had hit the flag during their lien search and had contacted her for clarification. She hadn't alerted Trent because the protocol required her to wait for my authorization. She said, "The sale can't close until that flag is cleared. If we bring the original addendum and the UCC release to the closing, the whole fraudulent filing collapses. But I need you to be physically present when they try to force the final signature. They'll have to bring you to the closing because they need your signature on the release. Can you do that?" I told her I could, and we began to plan. The following week I staged a test. I needed to know if Trent had any remaining scrap of humanity, any flicker of care for me that might complicate what I was about to do. So I stopped taking my blood pressure medication for 3 days. I'd consulted my doctor without giving her full details, just enough to know that a short lapse wouldn't cause permanent damage, but would make me feel dizzy, weak, and possibly faint. On the 4th morning, a Tuesday, I timed it carefully. Trent was in his home office, preparing for the alleged closing that was scheduled for 11 a.m. that Friday. I walked toward the kitchen, passing his office door, and let myself collapse in the hallway. I didn't fake it. My body was already woozy, my vision swimming. I crumpled against the wall with a loud gasp, clutching my chest, my face draining of color. I lay there on the hardwood floor, the world tilting, and made a wet, ragged sound. I heard his office door open. I saw his shoes, brown leather loafers, appear at the edge of my vision. He stood over me for a long moment. There was no sharp intake of breath, no "Claire, are you okay?" Nothing. He said, clear and flat, "Not now." Then he stepped over my body to reach the far side of his desk where the forged dissolution folder lay. He grabbed it, tucked it into his briefcase, and said to Elise, who had appeared at the other end of the hallway, "We're closing at 11. Don't let her miss the signing. Call an ambulance if you want, but she needs to be at that table." Elise looked down at me, her expression unreadable, then turned and followed him. I lay on the floor for 10 minutes, listening to their retreating footsteps, and that was the moment the last filament of family loyalty inside me dissolved into nothing. I pushed myself up slowly, made my way to my room, and took my medication with a glass of water. Then I called Rachel and told her I was ready. The closing was set for 11 a.m., that Friday at a branch of First Federal, the same bank where my safe deposit box lived. Trent had told me it was a routine tax form to release the proceeds and that I just needed to sign one paper. Elise helped me dress that morning, choosing a beige cardigan and supportive flats, as if I were a doll she was arranging for a photo. I wore a large purse with the PVC tube inside, my phone fully charged and set to record audio using a voice memo app that saved directly to the cloud. I had already shared my phone's location with Rachel and the FBI contact she'd looped in. I ate a small breakfast of toast and deliberately left crumbs on my sweater to reinforce the image of harmless, foggy older women. We arrived at the bank conference room at 10:45. The room had an oval table with a fake wood veneer and a pitcher of water that no one touched. A representative from Orchard Fresh Brands, a man named Lewis in a grey suit, sat across from me, flipping through a binder of documents. A notary public sat at the corner of the table, a young woman with a stamp sealed in plastic, clearly hired for the day. Trent and Elise flanked me like sentries. Trent slid a single sheet toward me, a final distribution acknowledgement that acknowledged my receipt of my proportional share of the sale proceeds and waived all further claims. Beneath it was a small gift clause mentioning a token of appreciation, a crate of cider valued at $7,000. He had the gall to put it in writing, on bank letterhead, as if that legitimized the theft. I picked up the pen they'd left by my hand. It was a cheap ballpoint with a chewed cap, the kind of pen that would smudge if you pressed too hard. I turned it over twice, removed the cap, and set it down without writing a single letter. I looked directly at Trent. His face was a mask of patient encouragement, the kind you'd give a confused elder aunt. I said in a voice that was completely steady and much clearer than he expected, "I'm not signing anything. You forged my signature on a dissolution 6 weeks ago. That document is already with federal investigators. Every dollar of this sale is frozen until my original partnership agreement is verified, and I happen to have it right here." I reached into my purse and placed the PVC tube on the table with a hollow thump. Trent's smile held for a fraction of a second, then cracked. "Mom, you're confused again. I think we need to get you home and pick up this conversation when you're feeling clearer." He reached for the tube, but I pulled it back. The conference room door opened. Rachel Keane walked in, a tall woman with a sharp grey bob and a binder tucked under her arm. Behind her came 2 agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, their badges visible on lanyards around their necks. One of them had a gloved hand and a clear evidence bag. Lewis from Orchard Fresh Brands stood up so fast his chair tipped backward and hit the wall. Rachel placed her binder on the table, opened to a tabbed section, and said, "Mr. Trenton." The title search uncovered a UCC1 financing statement filed by Martin's Reserve Holdings, an LLC controlled by Claire. That flag has prevented the transfer. This dissolution you filed is void, and the document you're using to close is fraudulent. Agents, the forged dissolution is in his briefcase. One of the agents stepped forward, unzipped Trent's briefcase from the side, and lifted out the manila folder with a gloved hand. I slid the original partnership agreement and the succession addendum out of my PVC tube and laid them on the table. The notary leaned over, her face pale, comparing signatures. Trent started shouting about power of attorney, about an elderly person being manipulated, about his rights. Elise sat frozen, her real estate smile shattering like a dropped mirror. The FBI agent looked at me, then at Trent, and said, "Sir, you're being detained for questioning in relation to federal wire fraud and forgery. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Trent's voice rose to a pitch I'd never heard, raw and cornered, but the agents were efficient and calm. They cuffed him in the lobby 10 minutes later, and Elise was taken in a separate car on conspiracy charges. I walked out of the bank with the original agreement tucked into my purse and a small paper cup of water the bank manager had handed me, because she'd seen the whole thing and thought I might be in shock. The legal aftermath was a slow grind of depositions, evidence exhibits, and courtroom testimony. The forged dissolution was a Class 3 felony in our state, and the intended wire fraud carried federal weight because it involved interstate banking. I testified clearly, unshaken, with Gloria by my side, and a binder full of documentation. The jury saw the backdated notary stamp, the fraudulent signature, and the recorded phone call I'd made from the cidery the night I found the barrel, when I'd called Rachel, and she'd confirmed the flag on the record. Trent was convicted on 3 counts of forgery, 1 count of attempted grand theft, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He was sentenced to 5 years in state prison, with restitution set at $405,000, representing my 45% of the $900,000 offer, plus legal fees and punitive damages. Elise took a plea deal and received 18 months in county jail, followed by 5 years of probation. The Orchard Fresh Brands deal fell apart after the publicity, but that was fine. The notoriety made Harvest Hollow more famous than any marketing campaign could have, and I started receiving direct inquiries from distributors who wanted to carry the cider that had survived a federal fraud case. With the partnership voided and Trent's 55% forfeited under the agreement's morality clause after his conviction, I became the sole owner of the LLC. The first thing I did was rename the business. I stood in the county clerk's office and filed an amendment changing the trade name to Pressed Betrayal Cider. The clerk, a woman with reading glasses on a chain, looked at the form and actually smiled. The second thing I did was design a new flagship product. I used the same heritage apples, the brown snout and dabinate, and fermented a dry hopped farmhouse cider with a crisp finish and a slightly bitter aftertaste that I thought was appropriate. I named it Truth and Consequence. On the label, beneath the ingredients list and the government warning, I printed the federal case number of Trent's conviction in small, clean type, along with a QR code that links directly to the public court records on the federal PACER system. Every bottle is a little monument to accountability. As part of his restitution and community service order, Trent is required to work at the cidery every Saturday, from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. He presses apples on the same hydraulic bladder press he used to brag about, a machine that requires muscle and attention. I ordered a pair of custom canvas overalls from a local embroidery shop in town. I specified the thread color myself, a bright orange that's hard to ignore, and the font, bold, sans serif, unmissable. Across the upper back they read, "Juice the Truth." He wears them every weekend. Tourists sometimes take photos and I don't stop them. I still keep Martin's cedar barks on my desk, right next to the lockpicking kit my dad gave me for my 16th birthday, a worn leather case with tools that have never failed me. Between them is the PVC tube, now empty except for a copy of Martin's letter. The original note, the one that read, "Do not trust my son. Save yourself," is framed and hanging in the tasting room under non-reflective glass. It gets more attention than the cider flight sometimes, people leaning close to read the handwriting. I don't mind, it's the soul of the place. There's a quiet kind of justice in outliving the people who underestimate you. I didn't need to shout or threaten or hire a team of fixers. I just needed to pay attention to details that others ignored: a lark's weakness, a ledger's imbalance, a barrel sealed with wax. Family isn't a blood tie you're born into. It's a contract of character, and when someone breaches that contract, the only right thing to do is to enforce every clause you've got, calmly, with evidence and a steady hand. I'm still here, running an orchard that was almost stolen from me, and every time a bottle opener cracks the cap off a truth and consequence, I hear a little echo of Martin's foresight, and I know he'd be proud. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments. If you want more stories about quiet revenge and the mechanics of justice, hit subscribe and the bell icon. I'll be back next week with another tale. Until then, keep your own ledger balanced and your larks checked.